This is our second of two narrative links where we're going to tell the story in between the books that we're studying. And so before we get to the account of the gospel according to Luke, we are going to tell the story between Jeremiah and the book of Luke. So during our study of Jeremiah, we saw that he rightly said that the exile will last 70 years. Now, one exile, his name is Daniel, the one who writes the book of Daniel. He's in exile and he's reading the scroll of Jeremiah, and he comes across these passages where it talks about the exile only lasting 70 years. Now, he's reading these towards the end of those 70 years, and so he begins to intercede and ask the Lord to bring about their delivery from exile. Now, this is in Daniel chapter 9, and as he concludes the prayer, God comes and shows up and gives a rather not such hopeful message and says, okay, Daniel, this is around Daniel 9:24, and he says, I said the exile would be 70 years, but it will actually be 7 sets of 70 years, meaning you've completed the first set of 70 years, and there's another 6 to come. So seemingly another 420 years, if you will, of exile. So not the most rewarding answer to prayer ever. And then God says that it's going to take this amount of time to do a few things. One, to bring an end to sin, and to bring everlasting righteousness. So until those things happen, the exile will not be completed. And so this brings us into what we call the post-exile time period of the Bible. Because after Daniel does his intercession, the people, a small group, a remnant, if you will, is released from exile. So when Babylon finishes, a new empire arises, and it's the empire of the Persians and the Medes, okay? And their king is King Cyrus. And around 538 BC, just after he kind of conquers and defeats Babylon, as Jeremiah prophesied would happen, he releases the exiles to go home. And there's actually 3 stories or 3 returns of the people, where 3 different groups of Jews leave Babylon. The 3 returns are led by 3 different people. The first return is led by the man Zerubbabel, and he rebuilds the altar and rebuilds the temple. Then the return after that is led by Ezra, and he kind of begins about rebuilding the people, if you will. And the third return is with Nehemiah, who he rebuilds the wall. Now, these stories are told in the historical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the prophets that are attached to those historical books are Haggai and Zechariah. They specifically talk about the rebuilding of the temple during the story of Zerubbabel at the beginning of the book of Ezra. Now, they return home and they rebuild the temple, but in a real sense, they're still in exile. Geographically, the exile has been completed because some have returned home, but theologically and in their mindset, they haven't returned, because when they rebuild the temple, God's presence doesn't fill it like it did the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. And so they've kind of had the rescue, right? The rescue out of a foreign nation, but they haven't so much had the Mount Sinai moment where God comes and dwells with them. Now, in the book of Haggai, it does say that God is with them, but it's in a different way. Secondly, there's no Davidic king to sit on the throne. Zerubbabel is a descendant of David, but he doesn't sit on a throne, and no one follows him up. And as we saw in Jeremiah, there's this promise that the end of exile will come about with a Davidic king. And so for these, and beyond that, they're still enslaved to, at this point, Persia. They're still paying taxes. And Ezra himself says in Ezra 9, verses 8 to 9, that they're still in slavery. So they're not really free, even though they're back in their own towns. They're back in their own cities. They're back in the land. Haggai, speaking to the group rebuilding the temple, he says that in 2 verse 9, he says, "The latter glory of this house will be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts." Because they've rebuilt this temple, and And they don't think it's very much, and they're upset or saddened because God's not filling it as he did this Temple of Solomon or the tabernacle. But God says the latter glory will be greater than the former glory, meaning somehow this shabby rebuilt temple will actually have more glory than the previous one. Now, in the immediate context in the book of Haggai, that's referring to possibly Gentiles coming in. So it's Gentiles and Jews, which is a more glorious than just Jews coming before the presence of God. But it can also mean that God will come to this temple in a more real, more concrete way than even the way he came into the tabernacle and the temple of Solomon. And we'll see how that happens in the gospel account of Luke. Secondly, in Malachi, Malachi 3 verse 1, it says, "And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." And so God's promising, I will return to the temple. I am coming to the temple. And so this is where the Old Testament story ends, with this post-exilic time period where God is not really in the temple. He's not really ruling over them as his king. There's not a descendant of David representing that rule, and they're still enslaved to the pagans. But God promises he will come. Then we leave behind the post-exilic time period, and we enter into what's called the Inter-Testamental Period, the time between the Old and New Testament, that kind of blank page in between Malachi and Matthew. Another way to refer to this time period is the 400 silent years, because there's no prophetic word. God doesn't raise up a prophet to speak to his people about what he's doing. Now, these years were anything but silent. There was a constant warring and transition of powers, and Palestine, this kind of land bridge in between Europe and Africa and Asia, always seemed to be right in the center of this battle because of its strategic position and importance on kind of the global scale. Now, one author, he said that on an average for the last 4,000 years, every 45 years, an army has marched through Palestine either to conquer it or liberate it. Extremely turmoil times for the people of God. So they were not silent. The times between Matthew and Malachi would have been very confusing. They were indeed tumultuous, confusing, to say the least, for the people of God. Now, Persia becomes the empire of Greece. Greece conquers Persia. This is Alexander the Great, and he forms a massive empire stretching from Macedonia all the way south to Egypt, and all the way from Greece over to India. And along with that conquering, he also expands their culture into the areas that they've conquered. And this is called Hellenization, where most of the world becomes under the sway of Greek culture. Greek becomes the common language. Greek philosophy, Greek worldview becomes the kind of prevailing thought of the time period. Now, after Alexander the Great dies, his empire is divided up between his 4 generals, 2 of which become kind of the main actors in regards to our story, and that's the Ptolemies in Egypt. They conquer Palestine for roughly 120 years, and then they're conquered by another branch of this Greek empire called the Seleucids. And the Seleucids actually control Palestine for roughly 60 odd years. Now, during their control of Palestine, we have what's known as the Maccabean Revolt. And these are where Jews rise up and they revolt against their foreign oppressors. Now, what kind of tipped the scale was one of the Seleucids. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. He's a horrible ruler, and he marched into the temple and he desecrates the temple. Many say this is what Daniel prophesied would happen, and he offers a pig on the altar as a sacrifice to Zeus. And one author says it like this: it was deliberately desecrating it so that the Jews would no longer think of it as the place where they were reaffirmed as a unique people. He established worship of himself there instead. This is referring to Antiochus. And so this causes a revolt led by a Jewish family called the Maccabeans. They push off this large Greek oppressing force. They cleanse the temple, and it seems as though this is the prophesied delivery. This is the prophesied rescue. But that only lasts so long, and the descendants of the Maccabeans are known as the Hasmoneans. And this creates the Hasmonean time period, where many think that it's a corrupt priesthood, and this isn't really the fulfillment, the glorified fulfillment that the prophets spoke about. And so there's whole decades of civil war within the Hasmonean time period. And this, many would say, makes them weak. And so when Rome comes on the scene and kind of conquers and takes over the Greek Empire, they can easily walk into Palestine because the Jews are so divided under the Hasmonean rulers. And one of the more famous events is in 63 BC, Pompey, the Roman general, enters right into the Holy of Holies. And he's quoted as saying that he doesn't really see anything, there's nothing there. And now this is as bad as Antiochus Epiphanes offering a sacrilegious sacrifice. Now Rome, because Pompey enters the Holy of Holies, takes the place as the main enemy of God's people. What used to be Babylon, what used to be Greece, is now the Romans. The Romans, to kind of control this area, they set up a puppet king known as Herod. And this is Herod the Great, as we see in the initial accounts of Matthew. And what happens here is he goes to Rome and asks for power over the Roman province of Judea. And they grant it to him, and they actually send him back to Judea with the label of King of the Jews and the task of liberating that area. Now you can see how this plays out in the beginning of Matthew, where there's this back and forth between Herod the king of the Jews being threatened that there's a new king of the Jews coming on the scene. Now Herod was an Idumean, which means that he was from the Edomite people. They're descendants of Esau. And if you remember back to Genesis, Jacob and Esau they battle it out for the privilege of leading the nation, or being the family that the nation comes out of. And so there's all throughout the Old Testament, there's tension between the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, and the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob. And so to have a Edomite sitting on the throne would be extremely oppressive, a shameful thing for the people. Now Herod the Great takes the temple that Zerubbabel had kind of rebuilt, and he renovates it and makes it this massive temple complex, the temple that Jesus goes into many years later, and he does this to kind of legitimize his rule. But all of the Jews don't recognize him as their rightful king, right? They're expecting a son of David to come. And so around the time Jesus is born, Herod is an old man almost on his deathbed. And as a result, that produces a flurry of rebellions, people revolting against that rule. And this is kind of the moment that the Gospels open us into, is this moment where the Jewish people are trying to, again, push off their pagan oppressors and bring about the kingdom of God. And we'll expand that and explore that a little more in our next topic in the Gospel of Luke. And so as we move from the Old Testament into the New Testament, we need to understand that God's covenanted people still view themselves correctly as in exile. Their sin that had caused their exile needs to be forgiven, and they need to be rescued. And so this is on their hearts and minds, this longing for a second Exodus. And so when we open the pages of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the people are kind of ripe with expectation that it's about to be that moment. The time of our delivery is near at hand. And so with that, we'll enter into our next topic, the Gospel of Luke.